So I'm here today to talk about company culture, performance reviews, and you, and we might as well kick it off. So I've already been introduced, but I am a site reliability engineering manager at a company called Splunk, and I work on our cloud product. Been a sysadmin for 9 years, so if you have Linux questions, I am unfortunately the person to ask. And I've been a manager for about a year, so I do know what it's like to be an individual contributor, or IC, as we call them in manager land. So this is written from the perspective when I was still an engineer before I became a manager. So I do have a confession. I've just finished The Mandalorian, and I'm back in my obsessed with Star Wars phase, so there's going to be a running theme here. If you are a Star Trek fan, I'm really sorry that you're not going to get these analogies, but also watch The Mandalorian. So you might be wondering why I have two pictures of Yoda on the screen, or for real fans, a baby of the Yoda species and Yoda himself. That's because basically in this talk, I want to take you from the child, essentially, lost and confused in the galaxy, to Yoda, who I'm pretty sure even Star Trek fans can agree knows what's up. So this is what we're going to cover today, and yeah, it looks kind of dry, so instead of reading through every single point on this slide, what I want to talk to you about is an experience that I had that's the reason that I decided to write and give this talk, basically. So I was going to say company A and company B, but it's kind of been spoilered by saying the companies I work for, so you'd have worked it out anyway. I'm going to say nice things, so I'll use their actual names. So I started my Linux sysadmin career almost a decade ago, distressing to say that, at Rackspace. I was there for 5 years, and I had a great time. It was a really good environment for me. I progressed a lot. I was promoted a couple of times, and one of the things I was really conscious to do while I was there is take on the feedback that I was given by my managers, specifically in my performance reviews. I really spent a lot of time thinking about that feedback and working on the things that they suggested that I should. Cut to 2 years ago, I decided to switch careers, and I came in as a senior site reliability engineer at Splunk. And I was having a great couple of months starting off, and then it came to performance review time. Splunk does things a little bit differently. They actually also ask all of your peers and random people you may have spoken to in the business for feedback and then give all of that to you. So I was nervous going into the performance review, but I kind of knew what I was going to get. I knew what I should work on from my old job and what I was good at from my old job. And it was a little bit of a shock because my manager sat me down and started to list things, and I went, oh God, it's all the things I was bad at from my old job. And then he said, these are the best things that you do. We're so glad you're here. Like, what strengths? Wow, amazing. And you could imagine that that was a little bit disconcerting for me. I was pretty sure I was being punked. But what it did do is it made me go away and think, that doesn't make any sense. How can something in one job be pitched as a weakness or a hindrance, and then in the other job, suddenly it's some massive benefit? So I've spent the last year thinking about that as a manager. And as a manager, I can tell you there's no easy answers to any of these questions. But what I can do is give you a broad set of assumptions that we can make about different companies, and then how you can career plan around that to kind of get the most out of it and basically do real well in your performance reviews. So the dictionary defines culture as the ideas, customs, and behaviors of a particular people or society. And in tech, we love to talk about culture. We want to talk about drinks after work. We want to talk about how my office has scooters and a slide. And we also really like to talk about it as a way to keep anyone who's not a white cis man out of our teams. But I'm not talking about that kind of culture. I'm actually going to talk about business culture. So that's how the culture of the whole organization permeates a team and impacts performance reviews, feedback, and your career opportunities. So sometimes it's easier to talk about what something isn't to give you a better idea. And so that's what I'm going to do now. Everything on this list, it's not company culture. It's a compensation package. These don't indicate anything about company culture. Your company provides these to you in order to create a competitive package to attract employees. It's instead of or on top of salary and stock compensation. These perks also tend to be thinly veiled ways to ensure that you spend more time at work. And if not that the time at work that you do spend is mainly spent at your desk. So not culture. These are other things that are often stated as culture on company websites. Baseline humanity, shouldn't have to list these. That's not culture, that's what I expect as a human from you. So what is culture then? Well, it's about risk. For those of you who are young and don't understand this, this is the Death Star. So what are we willing to gamble in order to get our big payday or Death Star explosion? If you've not seen Star Wars, but it was a very risky move. So culture is about risk, right? Risk is the exposure of something to danger, harm, or loss. So we're always trading off risk with what could we gain if we take that risk. That means that there's two ways that we generally think about risk when you think about it. You say, what could I lose? And hey, what could I gain? Turns out that they've done studies on this, and humans have something called a cognitive bias that's been named risk aversion. So it basically means that we will always choose not to lose what we have over any potential gain. We will always be more prone to preserving what we already have. TLDR, your brain hates losing. As someone who's been banned from a lot of family Monopoly games, I can confirm that. What does that have to do with business then? What else? Money. All business decisions evolve around risk, and risk for a business, and let me be clear, I'm talking about capitalist business here, so like NGOs, it doesn't count. But for a business, most of them are explicitly capitalist, so the number one rule they have is to make money. That means the thing they don't want to expose to risk, money. So we can basically boil a company's culture all the way down to risk management. How much risk are they willing to take on? How much money are they willing to potentially lose in order to achieve their business goals? Once we kind of understand that, and we also know the human bias for loss aversion, you can begin to extrapolate that into the idea that the larger, more successful a company becomes, the more risk averse they're naturally going to be. They have more to lose. They have more customers, more money, and often, especially if they're IPO'd, they have to report to shareholders on top of that. In contrast, if you're a younger company, maybe a startup with a bunch of VC money, you're probably going to be more willing to take on a lot of risk, because what is VC funding? It's not just fancy gambling. So, much like the force, there must always be a balance. If we don't want to have risk, how can we mitigate that risk? How can we reduce it? Well, it's achieved through the introduction of everyone's most hated word, process. Process here I'm using really generally, so I'm just referring to anything that provides a way of creating repeatability and expected outcomes. So that can range from anything from a runbook for how to make a change. It might be automation that means the same result always happens, or it might be something like your onboarding documentation, or a structure around how you do hiring or reviews. It essentially means we risk less because we know exactly what the outcomes should be. Now, from a personal engineering level, you can begin to see that this generally provides us two very different environments or cultures. That's because there's two main ways that engineering teams reduce risk. One is through limiting the impact of individual change to affect large areas. You may have heard this referred to as blast radius. Engineering managers love to say that. And the other is through providing documentation and training to their engineers. This minimizes human error, bad, but also means happy employees, which means they don't leave, which means I don't have to spend all that money getting someone from 0 to 100. What will that look like for you, and how can you think about companies in that way to benefit your career growth? We're staying with the Star Wars theme. We're going to start talking about high risk, right? This usually takes the form of maybe a startup or a small product team in a larger company. It's focusing on a brand new area, right? These are risk-heavy teams. They're Han Solo and Chewie, right? Work it out as you go along, shoot from the hip, who shot first, doesn't matter, he's dead. Like we've said here, there's always downsides, right? You might do really well. You might end up famous for your real fast ship, or you might end up frozen in carbonite. But in this kind of an organization, an engineer can make a big impact fast. However, they'll generally spend a lot of time not really knowing what's going on. The organization could panic react to events a lot, and there's generally a lot of change. So there's almost always going to be a large degree of ambiguity and just, whoop, let's see what happens. So this is also, I'd like to add, where you're most likely to personally break production in some catastrophic manner. So this kind of environment is great for someone who might be already pretty confident in their technical skills. Or if you're at the start of your career, you might be the kind of person who just loves to throw themselves in the deep end. If you were that kid in swimming class who like dove off the highest high board, no, that was not me. I was in on the second step crying. But it also generally means there's a lot less support and documentation, so you'll have to figure things out as you go. And if you're someone who's able to help mentor or produce that documentation, you'll probably do pretty well in this kind of a company. So what's the opposite side? Well, It's the Jedi. So these are very risk-averse cultures. They normally take the form of more mature organizations, so we could think of like Dell, perhaps. So these guys have years of established wisdom, and that results in lots of training and mentorship. You usually get to learn and experiment in a really secure environment. They generally have like good tests, and you can't just push stuff to prod that will break it. And they're often built to teach you to grow engineers. Usually that also means that you get to do things that have a pretty large scope because they generally have a big, large infrastructure. So that can give you a little bit of a foot up into thinking about broader architectural issues. The downside is that the Jedi are slow to adapt, and they have a lot of meetings. All of those council scenes that are in the Star Wars, you understand, right? So they are a good place to learn how to make large changes at scale, but you do need to gain a lot of group consensus to do it, and you often have to go through a long period where you're earning that influence, essentially. So these can be great companies to start out a career in a really strong learning environment, somewhere that you feel safe that if you make an error, a test fails, and someone's going to come say, oh, your test failed, instead of all of the phones in the company are suddenly going to start ringing. It can also be a really good place to come to when you're at a senior level and you want to start working on skill sets that involve more areas of getting buy-in from other people. How do I influence other people to come around to my pattern of thinking? So those sound like pretty extreme sides, and you probably aren't going to end up in one or the other, realistically. Most companies and most of us end up like Princess Leia. You have both on hand for the right time and place, and hopefully you do not choose your sibling. But for the most part, we will kind of oscillate between these two poles, right? The companies tend to grow in one direction, while we as engineers may go back and forth depending on how our skill sets develop. For the most part, you'll end up working out which kind of culture we feel most comfortable in and where our strengths align. Now, you'll notice that I've said strengths a couple of times, and I want to be really clear that I'm not talking about technical strengths. I'm not talking about whether, oh, cool, I'm a Kubernetes engineer, or I write really good PHP. In fact, I'm talking about things like a broader set of skills. So I'm really good at writing clear documentation, or I'm a fantastic teacher, and people really tend to understand things when I've explained them to them. So essentially, some of us are built to be Yoda, and some of us just want to blow stuff up with our blasters, and some of us don't care. So there's one caveat to this, which is culture sits at many layers. So a company can be mature and really risk-averse and still have smaller teams that are accepting of a lot more risk. That's normally a greenfield project or a company that suddenly decided to buy a small startup and just, that's our new product. You do need to consider all of these aspects when generalizing company culture. But one thing that is true is that if you're at a mature company, but in a highly risky team, they're going to be able to become mature at a much faster rate than a startup normally will, because they just go to the main parent company and take all that process. So they don't have to work it out. So it will generally become more mature faster than a startup. So I said this was going to be about performance reviews, and I promise it is. So here's how this fits in. If you take one thing away from today, what I would like you to take from this talk is that performance has nothing to do with how smart you are or how good an engineer you are. Performance reviews are about how effectively your strengths assist the business in achieving its goals. A high performer is an individual whose strengths and working preferences align with the culture of the team. And now there's always growth in any feedback, right? You should always listen to it, but you should also understand that all of that feedback is always going to be situationally specific. So while you should listen to it and take it on board, remember to contextualize it within the larger culture of the team and the business. At the beginning of this, I said I had a personal example, and it really is personal. These are 3 pieces of feedback that were delivered to me. I want to be clear that this feedback was not wrong at either time. It reflected my performance in the context of the company that I was working in. So there are some things you can probably guess by this feedback, and also by what I've been saying in this talk, which is essentially that I'm pretty good at working out inefficiency. It's one of the things I love to do. I find an inefficiency, whether it's in an engineering context or a process context, and I want to fix it yesterday. I also am not shy to give my opinions in meetings. I will pretty much say, this is how I think we should do it. Feedback, no, great, we're doing it. Another thing I'm pretty good at and that I like doing is writing technical documentation. I like documenting a process or basically building a path for the person coming behind me to follow along. So what I'm going to do is discuss just a little bit how this feedback essentially was given to me. So at my first job, Rackspace, it was a much more mature company, right? So when I would turn up and I would see a process that I thought was ineffective or frankly dumb, I would turn around and I would say, yo, this sucks, like, let's change it now. And that wasn't great because there was a lot of context behind engineering decisions that had happened there. There were a lot of people involved, a lot of different teams that relied on a lot of those systems. And having someone turn up and want to just flip it and change how we did it, it wasn't necessarily great for a pretty risk-averse business that didn't like to take too many risks. So that was some feedback that I was given as, hey, work on this. Build larger consensus. You don't need to change every single tiny thing that's wrong right now. Similarly, it was a really mature company. So my desire to write a lot of documentation, to write War and Peace in my Jira updates, that was seen as my manager as a bit of a waste of time, right? We already have documentation for it, so just write, I fixed the problem. You don't need to write 20 lines about how you fixed it. So you can see how in a more Jedi-like organization, these strengths just didn't quite align with what they were looking for. When I moved to Splunk, we were a much younger organization. Splunk is quite a mature company, but the cloud department at the time was a little bit less mature in our processes. So turning up and saying, hey, I see this thing we have isn't great. Can I try something? They would just say yes, because a lot of the time the context for why that decision had been made was usually it was fastest or I just had done it before that way. So that suddenly became this real strength. I was turning up and I was fixing problems as they popped up. And because we were a little bit more happy to have risk, it was fine if I wanted to try something, and if it went wrong, I would just revert it, not a big deal. Similarly, we were a young company, we didn't have much context. Pretty much everything I did in the first 6 months, I had never done before, and I could never find any evidence of anyone else having done before. So my own leaning to documenting things was suddenly this huge strength where people were saying, oh, it's great that you wrote 37 wiki pages this week. That was a really useful time sink for you, essentially. Now we're very lucky that we have technical writers for that, so they've taken them and made them neat and taken out all my funny references, sadly. So here's the thing, that culture that I just described at Splunk, well, it shifted so much from when I started. We're now becoming more and more risk averse, which is great because we're successful. We have stuff to lose now. We have customers who would be upset. So does that mean it's time for me to get a new job because all my strengths are useless? No. There is, in fact, plenty of scope still for us to bring in new process, for us to improve efficiencies. And one of the cool things is I can now leverage a lot of that process that I learned at a more mature organization, and I can take the bits that worked and I can apply them and seem like a hero. So I've now found the strengths that I want to develop and focus on. And I know that they're particularly beneficial to a business that's somewhere in the middle, that's coming from startup into maturity and doesn't really know how to do that. So I can kind of understand that. The thing that you need to do is keep an eye on your strengths, how they're changing, areas you might want to grow into, and also your company, because companies change. And a job that you love today and is an amazing role for you, in 6 to 12 months' time, just might not be the right fit. So, that being said, how do we work this system? Well, check-ins. I've had a couple of worrying conversations that imply people are not getting regular performance reviews. Sucks, yell at your managers. But also, if your manager's not giving you a performance review, you should be giving yourself a performance review. Self-evaluation, essentially. Keep your brag document, go through it, check that you're on par. But instead of just having technical skills in there, I'd say also put in other strengths like, turns out I'm really good at getting things through change approval board. Or, hey, I've been mentoring and it's been going really well and I really enjoy that. So periodically evaluate your own growth, crowdsource it, speak to your colleagues, speak to your managers, speak to managers of other teams, colleagues on adjacent teams. And then assess whether what they think that cultural alignment is, does it match what they're actually doing? Because a lot of the time it's not going to. If they say, oh, we're very risk averse, we don't want to break anything, but no one ever has to review your PRs before you put them into production, I would question that. So generally, just think about the strengths you'd like to foster and how they might be useful to the business in its march towards maturity and more process, and then make sure these overlap to hyperspeed your career growth. How to assess, it's all well and good that I say assess it, but I don't tell you how. These are a few questions that are really useful. The answers to these questions will help you to judge how much process and documentation exists around the engineering work you're doing day to day. This can help you judge how risk-averse your team is. And this goes not just for, say, code that you're writing, it also goes for things like, hey, if we hire a new person, do I know what to do with them on the first day? Do I know what to do with them 2 weeks down the line? Again, all of this will tell you where your company is going to eventually, because everyone marches towards maturity and process, is going to need to put these into place and where your strengths can align with this. SLOs are also a really nice one because they are a literal percentage of how much the business cares about downtime. So they're neat if you can use them. So we've asked our questions, we've got our answers. How do we actually leverage this to our benefits? How do we form a plan? Well, if your preferences and strengths seem like they're a good fit for the current culture, that's great. Start working with your manager to find out where you think they can have the most impact. And I'm going to break out a little bit from our Star Wars analogies for the next slide. Basically, I've said, talk to your managers. If your manager is not useful, talk to another manager. Hopefully he knows a bit about your team. Now, why have I told you not to just find a senior engineer or a different mentor? Well, that's because I think that there's a very specific thing about a manager who manages on your team or near to your team that they can offer you and should be offering you. So I'm going to break away from Star Wars and go to my number one obsession, women's football. I know that this is not necessarily a sports audience, so I will be very clear. This is Julie Ertz. Julie Ertz is a center-back defender on the US national women's team. In 2015, when they won the World Cup for the first of two back-to-back times, she played every single minute as a defensive center-back, right? She then goes back to Chicago, her local team, and she continues to play center-back. The back line there, under her mentorship, becomes really, really strong. But what happens in 2016 is that we realize our midfield, that's the middle of the pitch, is really lacking. We have good players, but honestly, they're tiny, they're shorter than me, and they just get bumped off the ball. It's distressing to watch. So what our coach decides to do is he says, let's take Julie, who maybe you can't see to scale here, but the woman is big, like you would run away if she was running towards you on a football pitch. And he says, Julie, you're going to attacking midfield. Now, again, you don't need to know much about sports, but defender, attacker, not the same. So the reason that this is important is because basically that's a decision that only a coach can make. The coach understands that the midfield is where the business / the football team needs to focus. And he's taken the strengths that he sees in an individual and moved them into that position. Now, it turns out she did great there because what we needed was a little bit of brute force, and she absolutely brought that. And in the 2019 Olympics, she once again played almost every minute, but in fact, most of that was in an attacking midfield role and sometimes dropping back into defense. So that entire story is basically about how if you and your coach or your manager are aligned, you can work out how to make yourself indispensable, right? A good center back is always going to be decent, but one who can suddenly switch to attack and then drop back when they need to, that was a great example of aligning a player's development with what the team needed. And there we can see how that really just shoots your career up to the next level, essentially. So use your manager. Another engineer is not going to be seeing the bigger picture of who they're going to draft next season and what their opponent's weaknesses are. It really does sit with your manager to be able to give you that perspective. Perfect. So the takeaway from this, there is no wrong place. I don't want anyone to feel like, oh, I'm in the wrong place for the wrong stage of my career. There's merely areas that can help you focus on different strengths and skill sets. Ideally, you want to be in a place where what you view as your strengths are the same thing as what your boss and your teammates view as your strengths. So, know what areas you're strong in, or areas that you might like to grow into. And then think about the company culture and kind of use a bit of a yardstick to guess that I've given you from this. And when you find that you can align the strengths of what you bring to a business and what the business needs from you and from engineers, then you'll find yourself getting consistently strong performance reviews and plenty of opportunities to advance. that's my talk. Thank you. You can find me at all of these places, and we are always hiring. So.